little bit of a different type of educational speaker program. So I'm very excited about it. And before I start, David, would you like to just make your little announcement?
Yes, ma'am. If anybody should be interested, Thursday night, Susquehanna Valley Civil War Roundtable up in Sunbury is going to have their program. Now, the program is going to be a little unusual. Most people, Civil War Roundtables, talk about Civil War things. Only they requested, and I am giving the lecture on the Grand Army of the Republic and assorted veteran organizations and what they did after the war. So I've researched and studied the Grand Army for about 50 years. So if any of you would be interested enough, I think it's at the public library at 7 o'clock. If you're interested.
Okay, thank you. This is Mayor Curtin, Governor Curtin. And thank you very much. So I am Gina Howard, the chairperson for Educational Speaker, and it's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces and even some new guests come into our programs. HDAC, Historic Gettysburg, Athens County, is involved in barn preservation and encouraging people who have the older homes to redo them, period, if possible. And then we honored certain homes with our plaques for doing, brass plaques for doing this renovation that just enhances Adams County barns, especially barns. If you were by any chance had the January, February Celebrate Gettysburg, HDAC finally raised enough money for a $2,500 grant program for barn preservation, and the article is in here about the Trossel Barn. I have 2 magazines if anyone's interested in them. Their companion is a wonderful magazine for free. And I have some flyers on the table about our yearly programs, little quips on them that you're welcome to take. And in June, we have licensed battlefield guide Dave Weaver is going to present Eisenhower, the young Eisenhower though, not the general of the World War II. This will be Ike and Ken Colt, and what dilemmas he came up with and trying to teach machine gun war tactics, thank you, on buck bullets. So this should be very interesting, and the soldiers' influenza. So that brings us up to June, and then August we have Elsie Singmaster, and we have Sue Hill doing it. It's in our audience tonight. We have the French and Indian War, but Tim Smith, a wonderful program, and John Horner, our very own John Horner, coming in October with Craig Kaba to talk about medicine and the doctors here and the people here after the war. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to our actors tonight, George Muschamp and Sheila Supenski, who will be our Thaddeus and Lydia, and you're going to all wonder how that ending of the last scene in Lincoln, what do we really want to know about that? It might be answered because there'll be questions and photographs like afterwards. Ross Hetrick has brought in some Thaddeus things. If you'd like to take a look after the program for general information or to purchase. And we first started our program will be local musician Paul Christopher Moschette, who will be performing the first part of the evening, his original song on the ballad of Thaddeus Stevens. So if I can find Paul, we will start. There we go, Paul. Oh, excuse me. Please turn off your cell phones. Thanks.
Can I get a little closer, Paul?
The Ballad of Thaddeus Stevens. steel helped to turn the wheel at the ironworks that he owned just west of town. It helped the times and eased the fears of all the mothers who had tears by bringing heat to every schoolroom then around. He'd been in Gettysburg for years, speaking wisdom and easing fears, and giving strength to many people who were down. Just a common man, they say, and he proved it every day by doing good things for many people all around. You see, Thaddeus believed that learning was the answer to people's troubles, and he knew if we could educate and solve folks' need for learning, this would help fulfill their dreams and their yearnings. Club, foot, and hope, and his staggering lifetime work gave Thaddeus his ability to propel. And as he began to gain, through a lifetime of pain, being called the devil's child misunderstood. But he'd really do his part just by following his heart in that capital city we call Washington. He helped pass laws that set men free, but did anyone ever see he'd be the one who would illuminate our minds? So when I look around today, I understand why people say it was Stevens that would help the common man. Look at a classroom or a school, they further mankind evermore. I see Thaddeus standing smiling at every door. You see, Thaddeus believed that learning was the answer to people's troubles, and he knew if you could educate and solve folks' needs for learning, you would help fulfill their dreams and their yearnings. Men of iron, men of steel, helped to turn the wheel at the ironworks that he owned just west of town.
Quite enough already.
Well, I told you I would come back and help you with that later.
No, you've done quite enough. You know I'm not talking about housekeeping.
We'll organize your papers later. It's time you had your medicine and had a rest.
Oh, that vile concoction.
It keeps you healthy. Why, you look much better already.
It is not my appearance that concerns me. It's my disappearance.
What do you mean? You're not going anywhere.
Oh, come now, Mrs. Smith. Let us be honest with each other. I know I'm near the end. I've told my doctor it's a pretty square fight between life and death.
Now, Mr. Stevens.
Now, I'm under no illusions. I am near the end, and I'm quite resigned to it.
Why,
What is
you don't
this?
seem resigned.
What is
On the
this?
contrary, you seem rather troubled and agitated.
Well, you're right. I have spent so much of my life answering critics and shouting down ignorance. It seems incredible to me. I will no longer be able to fight back.
Your accomplishments in your career will speak for you.
As will my failures. 76 years. 76 years? What will they say about me when I'm gone? How do you think I'll be remembered?
Well, you've had a wonderful and important career. You were successful in law and in politics, and you made many people happy.
Oh, yes. I also made many people angry. I could never suffer fools gladly, even as a child. What?
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Stevens. I just can't picture you as a child. Please continue.
Well, even as a child, I was uncommonly serious and keenly aware of life's injustices. Just look at me. People always used to ask, do you never smile? I learned the ways of the world very early on. As a child, I had little to smile about. I learned the impact oppression has on those less fortunate. It tempered my life and forged my soul. Yes, I learned the bigotry and hatred of the world very early. But wasn't I the lucky one? I had only one clubfoot. My older brother Joshua had two. People used to tell me that my clubfoot was proof I was a devil's child. Later in life, at the peak of my career as a member of Congress, they called me Old Clubfoot.
Well, they also called you Old Commoner. Besides, I'm sure it will be well remembered how well you overcame your disadvantages. I still smile when I think of the time that woman asked you for a lock of your hair.
Oh, yeah, poor dear. Not a hair on my body for decades, and she asked for a lock of my hair. I'll never forget the expression on her face when I took off my wig, handed it to her, and said, "Here, take all of it."
I wish I could have been there.
Lydia?
Mr. Stevens, it seems strange to hear you call me by my first name.
Oh, yes, I know. Mrs. Smith. Lydia, you've been my housekeeper for 20 years now. I think after this much time, we may be able to call each other by our first names. Hell with what they say.
Mr. Stevens.
I always called you Mrs. Smith out of respect, and I always wanted others to respect you too.
Well, I suppose so, Mr. Stevens.
No, not Mr. Stevens. Come now, go on, say it.
Thaddeus. It's not easy to unlearn old ways, proper ways.
necessary ways.
Yes, unfortunately, necessary for them.
Lydia, you are an exceptional woman. I've been very fortunate with the two women in my life, my mother and you.
I wish I had known her.
She was an extraordinary woman. When my drunkard of a father, if you can call him a father, deserted us, she struggled to raise her 4 children. She was a woman of great energy, strong will, great piety. She worked night and day just to educate her devil child.
It may not have been a very auspicious beginning, but look at the success you had later.
Which isn't as if there weren't other failures. As a matter of fact, one of my victories was really one of my greatest failures.
What do you mean?
I became so intent on winning cases. I took a case for John Delaplane, a slave owner, who wanted to repossess Charity Butler and her 2 children. Charity had run away from Delaplane years before, had married Henry Butler, and had 2 children by him, Harriet and Sophia. But eventually, Delaplane found her and kidnapped her and her 2 children. Her distraught husband hired an attorney who argued that Charity's former master had brought her into Pennsylvania enough times that she had been there a total of 6 months, making her a free person under Pennsylvania law. Charity had meticulously tallied her days of frequent visits. I fought this thing all the way to the state Supreme Court, proving under law that unless a single visit had lasted 6 months, Charity could not claim freedom. Well, I won. Well, I lost. That case turned the ashes in my mouth. Never again in my life would I prosecute such a case. I found out early that upholding the letter of the law can be moral error if it violates the spirit of justice. I deeply regret taking that case against Charity Butler.
Do you have many regrets?
No, not at all. I always feel I was on the right side of the battle, except for that one case. But through the process, I have made many important enemies.
Well, of course you've made enemies. Your position was politically quite dangerous.
I suppose so. It's a wonder I survived politically at all. Even my mother tried to warn me. Lydia, she was right. Of course it made enemies. Once a young, pregnant Negro woman was found dead, possibly murdered, near the old well at the northwest corner of North Washington and Railroad Streets, outside the old Presbyterian church in Gettysburg. You remember? Just around the corner from my house on Chambersburg Street. Can you believe it? They accused me in the newspapers of that horrid deed. Normally, I do not respond to such accusations. But finally, I did sue one Gettysburg newspaper editor over it, Jacob Lefevre of the Compiler. He was convicted of criminal libel and defamation and sentenced to $500 in fines and costs, a considerable sum in those days, and to 3 months in prison. Oh, yes, I made many enemies. But I guess the people of Gettysburg and Adams County must have had faith in me because they elected me to the state legislature and sent me back 6 times the next 10 years. What is it?
I'm reminded of a story of another arch enemy of yours, Alexander Harris.
Good story.
Well, you remember, you and Harris encountered each other on the sidewalk, and Harris bellowed, "I never step aside for a skunk." And you, holding your nose, strolled past Harris and replied,
I always do.
wanted to ask you.
What is it?
Well, promise not to take offense.
Oh, Mrs. Smith, I'm far more likely to give offense than to take it. What is it?
Well, that railroad
Oh!
you tried to
The
sponsor.
infamous railroad, the tapeworm. I suppose you could say it was controversial.
Controversial. You wanted to connect the Wrightville line with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Controversial indeed. Everyone knew that those tracks were planned to run right alongside your Mariah Iron Works twice.
Well, you could say it would have been convenient.
But when your iron mills were losing money, you refused to lay off any of your workers.
Yes, well, why should they suffer for my poor business decision? I could afford the loss. They could not. Actually, it came as something of a relief when I discovered that, Confederate soldiers under General Jubal Early made a special trip just to burn down my ironworks at Caledonia. When I was told the rebels had burned down my forges, I said, "Oh, did they burn my debts too?"
Well, I guess you won't be remembered for being a great iron master. But you asked me earlier how I thought you'd be remembered. Now, I will ask you, how do you want to be remembered?
Well, all the things I fought for, that I believed in most deeply, foremost without doubt, was my devotion to education.
I remember your first year in the state legislature. You defied your political constituents and your political party and fought for an $18,000 appropriation for that little college in Gettysburg.
I argued for the establishment of the college and fought to get the money for its first buildings, and I provided the 12.5 acres those buildings were built on. I helped found and govern the college's branch medical school in Philadelphia from 1839 to 1861. Let demagogues note it for future use, and let it be carried on the wings of the wind to every one of my constituents, that in matters of this kind I would rather hear the approving voice of one judicious, intelligent, and enlightened mind than to hear the loud hurrahs of the whole host of ignorance. That's what I told them. We got our college. Stevens Hall and Stevens Street are two of the college properties named after me, but my honor has lost some luster in the case of the stream you and I remember as Stevens Run. With all the new development in that gracious town, it appears the stream has seen little more than a trickle lately. I hear that students at the college are now calling it the mighty Tiber. That, I hope when they come to write my obituary, they'll recall that in 1835, 3 years after the founding of the college, I led the campaign to save free public education in Pennsylvania. I trust, and we are called upon to act on this question. We will all take lofty ground and look beyond the narrow space that now circumscribes our vision, and so cast our votes that the blessing of free education shall be conferred on every son and daughter of Pennsylvania, shall be carried home to the poorest child of the poorest inhabitants of the meanest hut of your mountains, so that they may be well prepared to act well their parts in this land of freedom, and lay on earth a broad foundation for that enduring knowledge that goes on increasing through increasing eternity.
Thank you, Thaddeus,
What?
for all you've done for my people.
For your people? Consider what they have done for the good of the nation and to emancipate themselves. What I have done is little by comparison. Lydia, I can't say I knew what it was to be in your shoes, but I do know what it is to be poor and downtrodden.
You've always been such a fierce abolitionist.
And a fierce college trustee. 1854. Remember? Pennsylvania College, eventually renamed Gettysburg College, was experiencing critically dwindling enrollment. An influential coalition of the college's professors and trustees quickly assumed power to adopt a resolution to move the 22-year-old school from Gettysburg to York, Pennsylvania. When I learned of the scheme, I rushed back to Gettysburg, determined to oppose, single-handed if necessary, a very determined and mutinous crew of academic deserters.
I'm glad you fought to keep that old college in my old hometown, Gettysburg. I'm glad you fought to keep that college in my old hometown, Gettysburg. It was an act inspired by destiny and providence, as later shown by events of the Great Rebellion.
I'm sorry.
Thaddeus, I do give thanks for you every day, not only for defending my people, but for your defense of my personal honor and my reputation. I know we kept quiet about a lot of things, and it took a great deal of courage for you to defend our living together.
If they only knew.
If they only knew.
No,
things
Lydia,
that
we promised each other never to speak of such matters. I was never ashamed of you, and you have always been much more than a housekeeper. These last 20 years, you have proven to be the person closest to me, my most trusted, faithful confidant. For this, I thank you. Now, let us speak no more of the subject. Perhaps we'd best speak of other things.
Or perhaps we best not speak any more at all tonight. You should be asleep, you know. You have company coming in the morning.
Ah, yes.
Should I send word that he's not to come?
No. I'll see you.
I'm sure people would be surprised to know that you spend time with President Buchanan.
Old Buck. He was never really an enemy, you know? As young men, we got along pretty well. In fact, during my Gettysburg years, Buck asked me to join his party. Of course, out of principle, I couldn't do it. But another time, out of respect, Buck actually refused to take a case against me.
Oh, really? Then why did you call him, what was it, a blob of...
Oh, a bloated mass of political putridity?
That's it.
Yes. Well, he got me so damn angry.
And you also said that he died of lockjaw.
Well, yes, he simply refused to debate or even to speak at important times during the presidential election campaign.
Two lifelong, confirmed Pennsylvania bachelors.
Meaning?
But you're both opposites in every way. He's a Democrat, you're a Republican. He lives uptown, you live downtown. He's
Yes, well, my main problem with Buck had to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We were always poles apart, on the slavery issue. But Lydia, you know as well as I that in politics it is not good to harbor a grudge. We can agree to disagree and still be civil.
Well, why did
You still think we're
I
opposites?
still think you're opposites.
Opposites
I
can,
still say you're opposites.
can work together for the right cause. You know how many people thought that Lincoln and I were exact opposites. I did not always agree with the president's speed in handling things, but I supported his values. For me, the Emancipation Proclamation was long overdue. And as for malice toward none and charity for all, I thought that a noble proposition. But I also believe that the rebellious southern states should not be permitted to get off without some retribution. How can we have no malice toward a group that systematically persecuted the Negro people and seceded from the Union?
What is it?
Just a conversation Lincoln and I once had about Secretary of War Simon Cameron. I told Lincoln I thought Cameron was profiteering from some high costs on war contracts. Lincoln said, "You don't think Cameron would steal, do you?" I replied, "He wouldn't steal a red-hot stove."
And what did Lincoln say?
He laughed. But apparently when he told Cameron the joke, Cameron got very upset, told Lincoln he wanted me to retract that statement.
And did you?
Well, I told Lincoln, well, I said Cameron wouldn't steal a red-hot stove. All right, I retract the statement. Cameron probably would steal a red-hot stove. Lincoln said I outdid him on that one.
I declare politicians, the wheeling and dealing that goes on.
I'd like to thank our actors tonight, and if there are any questions for the audience, to our distinguished group here, feel free. And if there are pictures you'd like to have taken afterwards, come on up. So,
Okay, you know this is
any questions?
the Zoom there.
Must be one or two.
Ross, get up here.
This is also Ross Hetrick, who is part of the Thaddeus Stevens. You might see him around town quite a bit, so, but we're a little bit shy tonight.
Okay.
Was Thaddeus Stevens and his lovely lady actually lovers?
That's always the question. Okay,
Ross, you better take it.
if you saw the Lincoln movie, the last part where they have Thad jumping in bed with Lydia is fiction. Okay, Tony Kushner, who wrote the screenplay, in a panel discussion, even said Lydia wasn't even in town that day. So the actual event could not have happened, even if they were intimate. Okay. There's a number of things that speak against them being intimate. She did live in his house, like lots of servants did, but her two sons also lived in the same house, which probably would have put a little bit of a damper on any sort of activity like that. And two, she was a Roman Catholic, and she was buried in consecrated ground after her death. So either the Roman Catholic Church was pretty loose at that time, or she did not have the reputation that anybody would believe, allowing her to be buried in consecrated ground. Now, the things that argue against that is that Thaddeus Stevens was very respectful of her, demanded people refer to her as Mrs. Smith, which was uncommon for servants in those days. And he also left her like $5,000 in his will, and also ability to take anything from the house that she wanted to take, which led her to be a relatively wealthy woman. Afterwards, she bought boarding houses down in Washington, D.C., and was a pretty astute businesswoman. So I guess the bottom line is that we never really will know precisely, but if I were going to be guessing, I would say that they were very good friends, but nothing else. That's my assessment. Yes, back there.
How did Thaddeus get out of debt for the steel mill?
You know, that's a great question, because like after the Confederates burnt it to the ground, or after he left Gettysburg. I guess there were a couple different points where he was way into debt. He, at the time, in 1842, he was $200,000 in debt because of Caledonia, which was like millions of dollars back then. And he was actually suggested that he declare bankruptcy, but he said, I will never do that. I may take advantage of the bankruptcy laws in the next life, but never in this life. But he went to Lancaster, and you have to understand, he was like a super attorney. If you wanted to get something done, you went to see Thaddeus Stevens, and he could fix it. And he went over to Lancaster where there were more people, more business, and he was able to pay down the debt from his law practice. And he was just getting out of debt, and he was making some money when Jubal Early came through in 1863 and burnt the place to the ground. At the time, the manager of the iron mill pleaded with Early not to burn it, saying they weren't making any money there, that they were keeping it open for the sake of the people. And Jubal Early's response was, Yankees don't do business that way. Then they had the counter comment by Thaddeus Stevens that they burned the debts also. But I did a little study on that because it impressed me that he actually was able to get the iron furnace going again, and it seemed like he did most of that on borrowed money. And you also have to understand, he was extremely well connected, especially through railroad companies that were very much into helping their friends in Congress as they were putting a railroad across the United States. And there was some speculation that he may have profited from some stock transactions, which helped him rebuild his iron mill. So kind of a long answer, but he was an incredible financier because he kept losing money and getting it back. Maybe if he just didn't lose it. If he had never had anything to do with iron mills, he would have been much richer than he would have. Yes, sir.
Did he take any money from the damage during the Civil War?
No, actually he refused. He refused to take any money. In fact, his friends, and these are friends I like to find, his friends raised $100,000 to help him after the Confederates burnt it down. Like I said, I like to have friends like that. And he refused that, and that was donated to the charity fund over in Lancaster.
Wow.
Yes?
What was his connection to Lancaster? Because I think he's buried there.
Yes, he is. Well, what happened was, just sort of give you his movements through the years. He was born up in Vermont. He came down to York, Pennsylvania, where he was a teacher for a couple of years while he studied law. He then came over to Lancaster in 1816 and was here from 1816 to 1842. That was when he started the Moriah furnace. He closed the Moriah furnace, went over to the Caledonia furnace. He lost $200,000, and he says, I gotta find more money from being a lawyer. That's when he moved over to Lancaster, and he stayed in Lancaster from 1842 to his death in 1868. But he didn't really leave Gettysburg altogether. He continued to come back over here and visit, and also be involved in running his Caledonia furnace and he also had a lot of political connections, and he was also on the board of trustees of Pennsylvania College, which is now Gettysburg College. Yes?
I'm curious as to whether he had any connections with Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania. Whether they
I'm
were two
sure
actually-
he had connections with Andrew
To a
Curtin.
certain
I don't
degree.
know of any anecdotes or specific
But see,
instances.
I asked that on purpose.
Oh, because you're connected to Andrew Curtin?
I portray Andrew Curtin
Oh, okay.
for a number of years, and I also know that he controlled Congress through his Ways and Means Committee,
Right.
because in my chat with Abraham Lincoln, his name came up on occasion.
Well, Thaddeus Stevens was known as the dictator of the House.
Oh,
in fact.
definitely.
So he was,
If he didn't like it, it didn't get done.
well, yeah, but there were a lot of things he liked which didn't get done also. So, you know, he didn't get everything he wanted, but he was the most powerful congressman during
He was.
and after the Civil War. Yes?
I just have a couple questions. One is, one of your cases here in Gettysburg was it the first attempt at not guilty by reason of insanity?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that.
Did you have a relationship where you were almost going to propose to a woman at some point?
You know, my memory about his relationships with the, I mean, he did have interest in women, and I think there was some point where he was courting somebody, but I don't think it came close to actual engagement or anything like that. Now, as far as the insanity plea, that is one of the great misconceptions of that. I could give you a whole talk about myths about Thaddeus Stevens, okay? But that's one of the myths about Thaddeus Stevens, is that he won his first big case in Gettysburg pleading the insanity case.
Well, I read that he lost it.
Well, he lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he lost the case. You're right. He lost the case, but he did. But the myth is that he impressed everybody by pleading the insanity case. Actually, that's not true. And I have Brad Hoke, whose book is up here for sale, by the way, for $25. Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg. And he actually went back and read the legal record. And what it was the man was up for premeditated murder. Right? And this particular man was kind of addled, and he'd come up to this person he didn't like, and he killed him with a scythe, you know, one of these big rounded things, which is kind of impressive that he was able to even use that as a murder weapon. But anyway, he came up upon him and did this sort of out of a spontaneous reaction to seeing him. And so Thaddeus Stevens' case was not on insanity, but trying to lessen the charge to second-degree murder on involuntary manslaughter, okay, instead of premeditated murder. So it wasn't, if he was not pleading the insanity case. He did later on make a mention which caused people confusion. He said, 50 cases of murder, I got them all off, except for the one guy who was really nuts. So, or crazy or something like that. So, involuntary manslaughter was the actual case. Yes, John?
Well, it's my understanding that the Horner doctors that we're to hear about in October bought the house where they had their medical practice and lived in the second floor from Thaddeus Stevens. Is that right?
I believe, well, actually, the Horner brothers bought Thaddeus Stevens' house after he left Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And they would actually put him up when he would come over to visit Gettysburg.
Yeah.
So they were good friends of the Horners. Yes,
How old was Mr. Stevens when he died?
76.
And was he wealthy when he passed?
Well, yeah, considering that the Confederates burned down his place and he had all these losses and everything else, he actually left a pretty good sizable chunk of money. He actually, like I said, he left, well, he had $100,000 in debts. I mean, no, $100,000. Money we got money.
It's the payoff.
Yeah.
This sounds good. I like
He had $100,000 in outstanding loans to people, which were forgiven in his, at his death. He was able to give Lydia Hamilton Smith $5,000. He was able to give various contributions to churches in his mother's name. And then he was going to give $50,000, which was an impressive amount of money, to his nephew, who was confusingly called Thaddeus Stevens Jr., even though he was his nephew. Back in those days, I understand that there was a tradition of naming your kids after your brothers and stuff like that. But in any case, however, he had a provision there that Thaddeus Stevens Jr. had to give up the sauce if he was going to get the $50,000, and he wouldn't. So instead, the money went to founding educational institution, which is Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology now.
And what happened to Lydia? What happened to Lydia?
Lydia Smith, earlier said, bought a boarding house in Washington, D.C., and was, I haven't come across too much after that. She was a respectable boarding house lady down in Washington, and then was buried in a Catholic cemetery in Lancaster, where on her tombstone she mentions that she was the housekeeper of Thaddeus Stevens. Yes.
And Lydia was from Gettysburg, so
Right.
she moved to Lancaster with Thaddeus Stevens?
When Thaddeus Stevens moved to Lancaster, I think someone recommended her to Thaddeus Stevens.
Her cousin, Ann Child,
Okay.
recommended her. She was leaving, she worked for Thaddeus Stevens, and she was leaving his employ to get married, and she recommended Lydia. So Lydia.
Does she have descendants still living in Gettysburg?
What was that?
Does she have?
Descendants?
Descendants still living in the area?
I don't know of any.
Well, tell about her son.
Well, they were both kids.
Yeah, she had two
She had two sons.
sons.
They both died of gunshot wounds that were rather suspicious.
That was not connected to the war.
No, not connected to the
At one point, Thad had to throw one of them out, didn't he? For alcohol.
Oh, maybe. One of them killed himself while cleaning a gun.
Accidentally.
It was said, but Lydia didn't think that that was so, and she fought that decision of suicide, and then her other son died of an accidental gunshot after she died.
There's a lot of room for more research about that.
Was it unusual for Lydia, is it your name, Lydia, to have a boarding house? I mean, the mindset of the people at that time, she would have been a businesswoman. Wasn't that kind of unusual?
Not for Lydia.
No?
She was a very accomplished businesswoman.
My understanding is that's a typical business avenue for a widow or an unmarried woman to go, was to run a boarding house. That was pretty common.
Yes.
Lydia was never a slave, right? She was
Right.
born a free woman.
Right.
And what happened to her husband?
Her husband died. Lydia and, blanking on his name, Jacob, separated, and Lydia went to work with Thaddeus Stevens, and 2 years after that, he died. I don't know why, I don't know what happened.
Thank you.
Yes.
What were her dates? What year was she born and she passed away?
Lydia was born in 1813 and died in 1880, no,
17 years after that.
1819,
Do the quick math.
1889,
Something like that.
1889, just shy of 70 years old.
I don't know the dates, but I do know that she was born and died on Valentine's Day.
February 14th.
Yeah, Lydia outlived Thaddeus for about 15 years. Yes, it says in your playbill that Thaddeus died in 1868. 1868, in August of 68.
That's the lady back there.
Where was she
So
educated,
83.
and what was her education?
I haven't run across any research on
What was the question? I'm sorry.
About what was
that.
Lydia's
Lydia's
education.
education.
Oh, what do they teach people at the Russell Tavern?
But she had some sort of formal education.
Yeah, John.
A question for Lydia. Where were you born and brought up?
Born in Gettysburg, Russell Taverns Road,
Russell Tavern.
Russell Tavern.
Thank you.
Yes.
How long did the tapeworm railroad run?
The Tapeworm Railroad, this is the saga of the Tapeworm Railroad, okay, which is another Thaddeus Stevens myth, okay. As they had in the play, which I gotta get you to revise that, they basically said that it was done so as to enrich Thaddeus Stevens, okay. The Tapeworm Railroad was like a lot of state projects, like the B&O Railroad was financed through state funds down in Maryland. Lots of railroad companies were being built on state funds. And this was an economic development effort for that Thaddeus Stevens was doing for his constituents of Gettysburg. He was having a railroad built from Gettysburg to western Maryland and connecting up with the B&O. And it happened to run through Fairfield, and he had a furnace out there, the Moriah furnace, which actually, believe it or not, you can still see the furnace stack there. It looks like a pile of rocks with trees growing out of it, but it is still there, and it's something that the Thaddeus Stevens Society would like to try to preserve in the future, and maybe at some point we'll come to the HGAC and maybe seek their help also in preserving that. But in any case, it was to run past the Moriah furnace. However, the Moriah furnace was shut down in 1837, years before the Tapeworm Railroad would have been completed, okay? Because they were building the Tapeworm Railroad in the period around 1837 when the Moriah furnace was shut down and he moved his iron operation over to Caledonia. So to say he was going to economically benefit from the Tapeworm Railroad is false. Second off, about the Tapeworm Railroad, they say, oh, this was just a make-work project that, well, the reason it was called Tapeworm was because it was going through the mountains and it had a zigzag along so as to maintain grade. And, you know, that was, his political enemies were against him. And what happened was it was under construction. Then they had what was known as the Buckshot War. Does anyone here know what the, just a show of hands, I'm not going to quiz you. Anybody heard of the Buckshot War? Well, that's pretty good. A couple people. They really ought to teach that in Pennsylvania because it's the only time that I have read about where a armed mob took over state government and installed their own people against the democratic wishes of the people. And it was done here in Pennsylvania in 1838. What happened is there was a confusion or a controversy over who won some elections down in Pennsylvania, down in Philadelphia, and as a result, two houses were established in Harrisburg. The Democrats imported an armed mob from Philadelphia, which proceeded to take over the Capitol buildings. At one point, Thaddeus Stevens had to jump out of a window to get away from a rampaging mob. And as a result, the Democrats took over the Capitol, and all of Thaddeus Stevens' projects were killed, including the Tapeworm Railroad. Now, people don't realize the Tapeworm Railroad was built. 50 years later, long after the Civil War, the Western Maryland took over the right-of-way of what was to be the Tapeworm Railroad and built along much of the same route as the Tapeworm Railroad. So you can go out there on Iron Springs Road and you can see where the Moriah furnace was, and right along it is the railroad, which would have been the Tapeworm Railroad.
the buckshot war that you were talking about, that's interesting. How long were they in control of the State House?
They were in control. It was called the Buckshot War, by the way, because Governor Ridner ordered out the militia and armed them with buckshot. His big problem was it was around December of 1838, and he ordered out the militia after they had taken control of the Capitol buildings. And he wouldn't go in there to attack them, to have a real bloodbath. So basically, you just had all the mob in control of the Capitol and all the militia outside of the Capitol. And eventually, the people who were in opposition to the Democrats just gave up, and the Democrats took over the legislature. It took, I think I'd have to go back, it was over about a month's period of time that they eventually took over the, and then various efforts to overturn this seizure were overturned in the courts and in the various legislative areas. So if you read Brad's book again, which is a great treasure on this, you'll find that it was incredible that armed force basically took over the Pennsylvania. I mean, there was a possibility that the Democrats would have won if they'd gone through the court system, but they weren't willing to do that. They just took it over by force.
Ross, didn't the mob from Philly come out in train cars?
Yep, they did.
Trains. Imagine.
Came by train. They were
From Philly to Harrisburg.
I mean, it wasn't just like mobs in Harrisburg. It was imported mobs from Philadelphia, paid for by the Democrats.
Heavily armed, right? Heavily
right.
armed. Bowie knives,
Right.
pikes, halberds, take over the Capitol. Why not?
And I just want to add one more thing about Lydia. I just remembered a few dates. February 14th, 1813. February 14th, 1883.
Good, good.
That's
Yes.
I got a good story about how he got his law license, and then also, did he attend church here in Gettysburg?
He was a type of person that contributed heavily to church, but rarely went.
A minister once said that as far as God and the scriptures were concerned, Thaddeus Stevens' mind was a howling wilderness.
But he was always contributing to a lot of seminary students. One of the quotes I came across one time is he said to a seminary student, he says, "Go preach the Gospels, but never try to prove them." But he, as far as his law license, that was also an interesting story because what happened was he was studying law in York. The York bar there changed the rules while he was studying, saying only full-time students could apply for the bar. And so instead he went down to Bel Air, Maryland to pass the bar. And he went in with $45 and he goes in to a bar where the examiners say, okay, the first thing you have to do is buy us 2 bottles of Madeira wine. So they buy the wine and they ask him a couple questions. They say, oh, that's pretty good. Now you got to buy us 2 more bottles. And he buys 2 more bottles. Then they say, well, now we want to play this game, Flippo. Is that how you pronounce it? Flippo?
Fiplu. Fiplu. Anybody
Fliplo.
ever play Fiplu?
I'm sure.
It sounds more like Mahjong.
Yeah. So anyway, like I said, he came down there with $45 and left with nothing. But he had his law certificate.
And he said jokingly, that's how I passed my bar exam.
Bill.
Across the street from his house here in Gettysburg was Christ Lutheran Church, and that was founded in 1835. And to raise money, they had pew rent.
Right.
Thaddeus Stevens paid pew rent in
Yes.
a church that he never bothered to attend.
That's right. In fact, one person gave me a diagram of the pew that he rented. So he was a big contributor to churches, just never went. Oh, okay, back there, way back there.
Would you comment on Stephen's role in relation to the impeachment proceedings against Johnson?
It's a very controversial situation because he's gotten a lot of bad press on that over the years. And what you have to understand, looking at the overall situation of what was happening, Johnson was the worst mistake that Lincoln and the Republican Party ever made. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson just gave wholesale pardons to all of the Confederates. In fact, just to go off a little bit of attention, he held elections in the South right after the Civil War, where the Southerners elected Confederate officials to Congress. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevens, no relation to Thaddeus Stevens, was elected to the Senate. If the Southern Democrats had been able to take their seats in Congress, they could have joined up with the Northern Democratic allies, and they could have, one, kept slavery intact. Believe it or not, there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment outlawed involuntary servitude unless you're convict, in prison, which makes sense. You can't say, oh yeah, we'll let all the prisoners free. So the Southerners, being intelligent people, said, okay, we'll get around it, we'll make all blacks convicts. And the way they did that was they said, if you are black and you step off your plantation, a sheriff would come up to you and say, you got a job? No, I just stepped off the plantation. Well, I'm arresting you for vagrancy, and you have to pay $250. And of course, everybody has $250. So if you couldn't pay $250, he's put back on the plantation as convict labor. So they would have been able to, that was what they called the black codes. And so if they had taken over Congress, they could have continued to have the black codes. They could have renounced the federal debt and embraced the Confederate debt. And it would have just been a disaster for the nation. But what happened was Thaddeus Stevens and Edward McPherson, which is the son of John McPherson, which owned the McPherson farm out at the edge of town where the battle began, they came up with a plan to stop this. And what they did was the first day of Congress, all these Southerners show up thinking they're going to take their seats, and Edward McPherson, the clerk of the House, starts to call out the roll, and he gets to the Southern names, and he skips them. He just doesn't call them out. And they all jump up and down and say, you can't do that, you can't do that. Thaddeus Stevens gets up and says, point of order, we can discuss no business until we finish calling the roll. The roll is called, the Southerners are out, and that's the beginning of Reconstruction. Now getting back to your impeachment question, the South was just completely taken over with a reign of terrorism after the Civil War. If you were a freed black or a white loyal citizen, the Southerners would just kill you for trying to be exercise your political rights. And they actually had riots in New Orleans and Memphis where policemen would invade these various conventions and gun down people. The actual policemen who were supposed to be enforcing the law were going after Republicans down these areas. So the Congress felt it really had to do something to rein in this reign of terror down in the South. And this was why they came up with the Reconstruction Acts, which divided up the South into military districts. Now the problem with it, and this is, I guess you could say, a problem with our general form of government, is Congress proposes things, and then you have an executive branch which is supposed to carry out the dictates of the legislature. Well, as we all know, that doesn't happen all the time. And this was the worst case where the executive said, no, I'm not going to carry out the dictates. I'm going to actually try to sabotage everything that Congress is doing. And as a result, trying to get around this, Congress passed what was known as the Tenure of Office Act, where they said that Johnson couldn't get rid of Lincoln appointees because those were the only guys that were, nominally carrying out the orders of Congress. Well, Johnson tried to get rid of Edward Stanton? Yeah, Edward Stanton. And as a result of that, that's why they brought impeachment charges. But Thaddeus Stevens, throughout the impeachment effort, stressed that his main objection to Johnson was not just the violation of tenure of office, but the fact that he wantonly disregarded the dictates or the orders of Congress, which are supposed to be carried out under the Constitution by the president. So that's kind of a long answer about the impeachment. But they came, he was impeached in the House, went over to the Senate, and they lost by 1 vote.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. One more question.
Lots of things. You can come up here. You can grab some bios, free bios on Thaddeus Stevens. We have joke books for $2.
Thaddeus Stevens joke book.
Yeah, and you can also, if you'd like to keep up on Thaddeus Stevens events, we have a thing that you can.
I just wanted to add one more thing. Somebody back there asked about Lydia's descendants. Yes. Okay, she had 2 sons who both died childless, so she wouldn't have had any direct descendants, but she had cousins that live around here. I don't know, last name is Childs.
Childs?
Yeah, I don't know if any of them, her other relatives are still here. And one little publicized thing about Lydia is that after the battle here in Gettysburg, she came back and got a cart and horse and took some of her own money and got donations and went around to all the makeshift hospitals and delivered supplies with food and clothing for the soldiers. I read in one of the letters, I think she wrote it to Thaddeus Stevens' nephew when he was, it was somebody, might have been said, Thaddeus Stevens' nephew, that God put it on her heart to do something for those poor creatures. So she did come back and do that for some time after the battle here in Gettysburg. And that picture, I don't know if you, there's a small picture over there. Where is it, Reg?
Yes.
Of Lydia, right?
Yeah, this picture. This picture of Lydia, I believe is a portrait that Thaddeus Stevens had done of her that hung in his home. And he, this is also, there was one that was a painting of her that he had, but this is the only one I've seen. That one.
There's another.
This is a photo.
That's a photo.
Yeah.
This photo is at the visitor center with no name, no nothing. So if you go to the visitor center, you'll see Margaret Devitt, the woman that stands posed like this. That was Margaret Devitt. She was doing this for a newspaper. That was how they had tried to abduct her one afternoon over on Breckenridge Avenue.
She's showing how she was managed.
She was showing how they tied her hands together. So you see her like this, and they don't have her name either. But this picture is the picture of Lydia.
Really weird. They have one picture of Lydia Hamilton Smith with no identification. No pictures of Thaddeus Stevens over at the National Museum. Which, by the way, I noticed you have no pictures of Thaddeus Stevens either. I imagine that we're going to have to make a donation. So, anyway, if you get a chance, we do have a sign up for an email list. If you want to be on our email list, where we'll keep you up on Thaddeus Stevens events and such like that. And it's right over here, and put a pin there too.
You're more acquainted with it.
Oh my God.
soon as evening.
Thank
You
you.
did such a great job.